Welcome to the ADF Insider Essentials series. This series of presentations and demonstrations shows the essential tips, tricks and techniques you need for building ADF applications. Talking about building applications, this presentation looks at the ojdeploy ADF build utility. My name is Chris Muir, I'm an ADF product manager and I work for the development tools section of Oracle Corporation. So in three parts of this presentation, we'll quickly talk about the options you have to build jars, ears, wars, and ADF library jars. We'll then talk about the ojdeploy utility, what it provides, its features, and then look at a demonstration using it. And then we'll follow that up by embedding ojdeploy and Apache Ants. So in context of building ADF artifacts, such as your jars, your ADF library jars, your ears and wars, you really have a number of options. You can use the actual JDK utilities, such as JavaC and the packaging utilities to manually build all the ADF artifacts yourself. Not really recommended because the JDeveloper IDE can do this for you, and number two here is something that you as a JDeveloper you will already be familiar with. You know to right click on a project, click deploy, click the deployment profile that you've already set up to create a jar or a war, or alternatively click on the applications menu, deploy, and then the deployment profile to create an ear. But the problem with that particular set of options is it's relying on the developer to do it. What if you want to automate the builds, you want to script the builds? And that's where the ojdeploy utility comes from. And the ojdeploy utility is used from the command line or Apache Ants. It can even be used to call another utility called ojserver for large builds requiring lots of different packages to be built. In the future, it will be callable from Apache Maven via ojdeploy plugin that will be provided in JDeveloper 12c. And indeed, ojdeploy itself is used in Oracle Development Cloud Services via the Hudson, the Hudson server being continuous integration server being deployed on that. So ojdeploy is something that is used quite significantly by Oracle and the JDeveloper tool itself, and it is something that you need to become familiar with in order to automatically build applications. So in considering ojdeploy, what is it? Well, ultimately, it's a bit of a badly named utility. It's actually not a deploy utility. It doesn't deploy to a server. It's the build utility. It is used to generate the jars, the ears, and the wars. Now, ojdeploy itself is actually just a headless version of a full-blown JDeveloper installation. What do we mean by headless? Well, it's a UI or a user interface less. The UI side of the JDeveloper IDE doesn't show up when you run ojdeploy. So it's just really a command line utility that is calling JDeveloper but not showing you the IDE. And in calling ojdeploy, you're effectively accessing the build services of the JDeveloper IDE itself that we were just talking about before that you would normally access by right-clicking on a project and clicking deploy, or via the applications menu and deploy. Okay. Now, just like those options in the JDeveloper IDE, you know in order to call those, you need to have checked out a workspace and have all its application source code locally. In addition, you also need the JDeveloper IDE to be installed, and this is also true of ojdeploy. It's not a utility that sits there by itself. It is actually the full-blown JDeveloper version just running in headless mode. Now this creates one of the contentious points about ojdeploy for some of our customers out there is that, hey, if I want to use ojdeploy on, let's say, a continuous integration server such as Hudson, are you telling me that I have to go and install the full 1.8 gigabytes of JDeveloper? Yeah, we are telling you that. Now you could go and instead build all these jars, these ears, and the wars themselves, but the fact is that ojdeploy has a lot of smarts, a lot of features built into it that you are going to harness in building your applications, and we'll talk about those in a moment. But in addition, that 1.8 gigabytes in terms of disk space, geez, disk space is cheap these days. I think people who are worrying about 1.8 gigabytes of disk space versus all the features that you get via ojdeploy and indirectly JDeveloper, these are significant features, and you're basically not really thinking about the benefits here. So what are those benefits? Well, ojdeploy provides a lot of different facilities. One of the things it does, which it also JDeveloper does at design times, is it validates all those XML files that we're working with. And it's just not validating them from an XML hierarchy point of view, making sure you've got the right opening and closing tags and attributes. It does all the other sort of checking, like making sure you're entering the right values for particular attributes based on code elsewhere in your application. So all those smarts you get at design time, you now also get at build time from the command line ojdeploy utility. In addition, when you're generating specific ADF artifacts like ADF library jars, which are not a part of the Java specification, they're the proprietary type of jar provided by Oracle, it includes additional metadata files that are required by the rest of the tooling. So, for example, you might be familiar with opening ADF library jars within the resource palette within the JDeveloper IDE, and when you do that, it reveals to you all the task flows revealed within the ADF library jar. Well, how does it do that? Well, it knows that via an internal file called the task flow registry XML file, which has all the task flows effectively registered within that ADF library jar. What generates that? Well, it's the build mechanisms of JDeveloper and therefore the build mechanisms of ojdeploy. If you don't use ojdeploy or JDeveloper to generate those ADF library jars, instead you maybe use your the JDK, JavaC command line and packaging utilities, you'll need to create that file yourself. Now, each version of JDeveloper that Oracle comes along with, you're going to have to check the structure of the task flow registry XML files that we generate to make sure that you're still compliant. This is a huge overhead. Why not just use our utility to do that for you? So running on with this slide here, we do generate a whole bunch of other files. For instance, the connection XML files. We generate all the security files required. We pay attention to the Oracle deployment profiles. There's a whole bunch of intelligence built into this tool. And as Oracle continues to extend the JDeveloper IDE with all those build utilities, ojdeploy will get that as well. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to be doing this all manually. Use the ojdeploy utility. Sacrifice that 1.8 gigabytes of disk space to get all the features that we're providing you. So putting the features aside, how do we actually make use of ojdeploy? What I'd like to do now is demonstrate to you the ojdeploy utility used from the command line. Now, in order to demonstrate using the ojdeploy from the command line, what I'd like to do is return to JDeveloper, which I happen to have running in the background here on my Apple Mac. And you can see I already have a pre-configured application called ADF Demo App, okay? Now what I want to do with ADF Demo App is, well, first of all, I just want to show you how we would typically create the deployment artifacts from the IDE. Now you're familiar that what we do is we right click on a project, we go to the deploy option, we click on the deployment profile here, and we can see via the deployment window it has then generated a jar file to this particular directory. Just to check that, okay, here is that actual set of directories for my project, for my application I should say. There is the model project, and now you can see the jar file that we just generated. And for the purposes of the demonstration, I'll just delete that because we're going to generate that via ojdeploy in a moment. Alternatively, if we return to JDeveloper and we click on the Applications menu and then Deploy and then this deployment profile here, we see we're going to generate the EAR file. Okay, so in context of the deployment window, we can see we generated an EAR file in this location. And again, on my Apple Mac, if I return to the parent deploy directory, we can see that EAR file that was just generated. Okay, let's delete that. So with all that in mind, let's now go and do this from the command line or a terminal prompt to actually generate these files using ojdeploy. Okay, so here I have a terminal. Now I actually am already in the directory where that application is located, and what I want to do is call the ojdeploy utility. So I'll just enter the path for where that's installed on my local machine. This is obviously going to be different for your machine. Oops, got the wrong directory there. Okay, so you can see me calling the ojdeploy utility within the jdev bin directory or wherever I've installed JDeveloper. Then the first parameter that I need to enter on that particular command for ojdeploy is the workspace. Okay, so here we need to put in the full workspace path leading to the JWS file or the JWS Java workspace file that actually is the configuration XML file behind this application workspace in JDeveloper, and you can see the path there. In addition, because we want to generate the model project, we need to specify the model project on the command line and, in turn, the deployment profile here, ADF Demo App Model ADF Lib. Okay, so returning to the command line, in order to do that, I need to go Project as a flag and go Model, and then Profile, and then actually enter the deployment profile. Okay, whoops, got the wrong case in there, and now we press return. You can see the ojdeploy output, and it's telling you what parameters are running. It's running with, so workspace, project, and profile. Now you can see it building the application. At the end, we can see it finished. And while it might be a little bit hard to see here, you can actually see that it's generated a jar file to the deploy directory of the model project. Just to check that now, if we go back to the Finder on my Mac, you can see the model deploy. There's the jar file we just generated. Okay, pretty easy, right? So alternatively, now let's go to back to the command line, and rather than generating the project model project jar, let's actually generate the ear for the application. So what I'll do is just go back to the previous command where we're executing the ojdeploy utility. We've still got the workspace parameter pointing to the JWS file, but now we don't actually put the project in. We just name the actual profile that we want to generate. And in this case, you might remember we had this particular deployment profile for the application workspace. Let's just go back and prove that. If we go back to JDeveloper application deploy, you can see that name there, ADF Demo App Project 1 ADF Demo App. So returning to the command line, okay, so that's what we've got now, ADF Demo App Project 1 ADF Demo App. We can press return. Again, you can see the options that ojdeploy is working with, the workspace and the profile. It's now building the application. It takes a little bit longer because it's going to generate two files, the war and the ear. You can see deployment finished, and if you look very carefully here, you can see that it's generated the ear file. And again, we go to the Finder, we now go to deploy, we can see the ear file's been generated there. Okay. Now let's just delete those again. Let's delete the model project one. Whoops. Okay, and with that point, we'll just return to the presentation. Okay, and now we've demonstrated calling ojdeploy for the command line. Now that's not the only way we can call ojdeploy. The other way we can call ojdeploy is from Apache Ant. Now, as a Java programmer, you'll be familiar that Apache Ant is the scripting language used for provided with Java for doing builds and all sorts of other tasks that require when you're building applications, such as copying files to different directories, deleting files, but also building applications, calling the JavaC compiler, the packaging, and so on and so forth. And if I said before that we don't want to make use of those utilities, right? We want to use ojdeploy to do all that compiling and packaging. How can we do that from Apache Ant? Well, you can either in Apache Ant call the command line version of ojdeploy, but even better than that, we can actually set ojdeploy up as a native task, okay, by using a taskdef call within Apache Ant to treat ojdeploy just like any of the other task types in Apache Ant, and we can make use of ojdeploy that way. Okay, so the real advantage of putting ojdeploy in Apache Ant is then you can make use of those Apache Ant scripts wherever you can call Apache Ant from. So typically that's wherever you've got Java installed and JDeveloper installed, you can now make use of that Apache Ant script. So that can be from inside JDeveloper, from the command line, or more importantly from continuous integration tools like Hudson and Jenkins that can make use of Apache Ant as well. Okay, so really useful to start looking at embedding ojdeploy in Apache Ant because Apache Ant is such a versatile building utility for Java overall, and it's used by a lot of different Java infrastructure type tools such as these CI tools that I'm referring to. So with that in mind, again, let's demonstrate how we actually make use of ojdeploy, but this time in Apache Ant. Now, Apache Ant, if we just return to the JDeveloper IDE, Apache Ant, the key configuration file for Apache Ant is something called a build.xml file, and ultimately that's the Apache Ant script file. Now, we want a build.xml file with ojdeploy within it. So how do we go about setting one of those up? Now, the really nice thing about JDeveloper here is it will actually generate the right build.xml file for you. So what we can do is click on New and go to the New Gallery All Features option at Build File from Project, okay? And what it's going to do here is generate the build.xml file, and if we click on this last option here, it's going to include the task definition for ojdeploy. So we click OK. Now notice what happened here. it generated the build XML file, but it also generated a build properties file. Let's look at the build properties file first. If we have a look at the builds properties file, we can see these key value type pairs. We've got something called Oracle Commons, we've got installed directory, and so on and so forth. Now these are all the runtime properties that the build XML file will refer to using these keys. Okay. Now how are these keys referred to? We have a look at the build XML file, which is an XML file, correct? You might notice you see syntax like this. Dollar squiggly brackets oracle.commons squiggly brackets or ellipses. Okay, if we look back at the build properties file, you'll see that we've got Oracle Commons, and that Oracle Commons, the value that's substituted in here, we can see volume, Seagate, Oracle JDev, Oracle Common. That's the value that's substituted in here. So these are essentially just variables within our build script that we'll make use of. Now looking at the build script itself, you can see it's an XML script. It has all these paths of jar files that it's loading in, and these are all the ADF library jars, so great. It's configuring these for us. If we look down the bottom, probably the most important thing within the overall build XML file is these things called targets. And these are different runnable actions or runnable targets within the build XML. And we might notice that there is this one called, a target called deploy. And within that deploy, it actually has one that it's called ojdeploy. Okay, so this target deploy is defining a new type of task called ojdeploy based on some of the parameters here. This ojdeploy is coming from something called a class path, so it must be some sort of Java class that's being loaded in Oracle JDeveloper Ant Library. If we go back to our build properties file, Oracle JDeveloper Ant Library, there's a jar file that must have the ojdeploy code within it. Great, so what the build XML file is doing here is setting up some sort of task based on ojdeploy that we can use. And indeed, if we look at the next line, we can see ojdeploy. Okay, ojdeploy being called, there's some sort of executable that's been called. Oracle JDeveloper ojdeploy path. And again, let's go back and have a look here. Right, there's the executable that we used to call from the command line. Can you start to see how this is all hanging together here? And in turn, ignoring some of the options, but looking at these parameter options, these look familiar. Workspace, project, and so on. If we go back to that command line that we were looking at earlier, just scroll up a little bit. Right, we called ojdeploy from the command line. There it is there. And when we ran it, there we go. There's ojdeploy being called with parameters, workspace, project, profile, and so on. So returning to the build XML file, we can see these additional parameters. Okay, so we can see the workspace. Right, it's trying to call Oracle JDeveloper workspace path. So again, we look back over here, Oracle JDeveloper workspace path. There's the JWS file that we called from the command line earlier. In this case, the project is Oracle JDeveloper project name. Well, if we look at it here, view controller. Why is it view controller this time rather than the model project? Well, I happen to create this Ant script in the view controller project, so that's the one it's picked. What else we got here? Profile. Okay, the profile name that it's going to use, the deployment profile name is, it's star. So in this case, what it means, rather than specifying a specific deployment profile from the view controller project, it's going to pick them all out and loop through them. If we actually look at the view controller project, project properties and deployments, it only has one deployment profile, so it's only going to use that one. And this particular one creates a WAR file. Okay, other options in the build XML file. Now, this no compile option, I won't go into it, but just to say remove it. It's not necessary for this deployment, this build XML file. So what are we left with? Output file. Oracle JDeveloper deploy output file. What's that? Oracle JDeveloper deploy output file. It's going to deploy a file to the deploy directory based on the profile name. Right. That's probably going to be the file that it creates. Okay, so you've got the general idea of what this build XML file is doing now, and really all it's doing with a bunch of parameters and a bit of configuration to make ojdeploy callable from the actual Apache Ant, we're then just passing in the parameters that we very much did on the command line earlier on. Now, this Apache Ant script can now be used by external tools such as a continuous integration service such as Hudson or Jenkins, but JDeveloper makes it really easy for us to actually test this script here, because what we can do is on that build XML script, you can see the little ant symbol there, so we can right click, run ant target, beauty. We've got all those targets that we saw defined in the build XML file. We pick the deploy option, switch to Apache Ant. Look, there's the output. Awesome, the same output that we kind of saw down on the command line. We can see the ojdeploy being called, workspace project profile, build successful, and it's a little hard to see here. I'll just scroll over a little bit. You can see that it's generated a WAR file for us. And just to prove the point, if we go back to the Finder, and now we go to the View Controller Project, deploy, voila, we can see the WAR file. Okay, so now we've made use of ojdeploy from Apache Ant. Returning to the presentation, to conclude, ojdeploy, what does it do? Well, it's just the builds facility that's provided in the JDeveloper IDE for building your jars, your wars and ears, and your ADF library artifacts. But as we said before, it is just not a Java C compiler and a packager. Okay, it actually has more intelligence built into it to assist you to build your applications. In fact, build compliant ADF library jars and other constructs needed by future middleware infrastructure. In particular, where ojdeploy becomes really important is that it allows you to automate your builds and take the build process out of the hands of your developers. Now, your developers are all good and fine, but when they start making mistakes, and we know human error is something that creeps into building applications all the time, this is a problem. And we really want to introduce automated builds in order to avoid those sort of issues that humans introduce into computer system software development. Finally, once you set up ojdeploy and you start making use of it via Apache Ant, you'll find that you can start to use this scripts in all sorts of tools, such as CI tools like Hudson, Jenkins, and even in tools and future tools and cloud services such as Oracle Development Cloud Services. Thanks for listening to this very quick presentation. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you're interested in watching more ADF Insider Essentials presentations, they're all effectively accessible via oracle.com/technology/jdev. And in addition there, you'll find all sorts of other things such as downloads, tutorials, our discussion forums, samples, ADF developer guides, and much, much more.